Welcome to the Talent Time Machine, the podcast that takes you on a trip to work in 2050 and asks what the future means for us right here, right now. I'm your host, Marissa, and today I'm excited to welcome Reanna Browne, futurist, academic, and founder of Work Future, a strategic foresight consultancy helping organizations get better at using future possibility to navigate their choices in the here and now. The world of work is driven by planning and forecasting. The further forward we can see, the clearer our next steps become. But the pace of change around us often leaves us running to catch up, not thinking about our direction of travel. So how good are we at imagining the future? Should we obsess about the accuracy of our predictions or focus not on a single future, but the different futures that gazing into our crystal balls reveal to us? How can we get better at imagining the future? Together, we'll explore the answers to these questions and more with Reanna. So, fasten your seatbelts, loosen your imaginations, and let's travel to 2050 and beyond with the Talent Time Machine. Reanna, I'm interested to know why you find value in looking so far ahead. We're talking about 2050 here on this podcast, but what's the purpose and value in looking so far ahead when our planning cycles tend to be 2, 3, 5 years? What's the value in speculating so far out?
It's such a good question. We can use the idea about the future to actually rethink action in the present. So for me, it's almost the tyranny of the urgent. So when we don't look forward, we end up in a cycle of the current dilemmas kind of repeating themselves. But of course, the future never arrives, so we're always in the present. So our futures actually happen via the things that we do today, but also the things that we don't do today. So it's kind of like I mentioned, it's the tyranny of the urgent. So when we don't think about the future or think about change, we actually miss a whole range of opportunities to do things differently. When we take a 10-year view, we tend to lift our gaze from the current dilemmas. So a really practical example, working with a program manager in IT, and I was saying, think about your planning for the next 10 years. You know, what staffing needs would you need? And he said, oh, well, I might need this many programmers, this many coders, for instance. And I said, if you took a 10-year view, would you change your decisions that you have to make right now? And he said, well, actually, yes. If I took a 10-year view, I might start to reconfigure who I look to hire and why because of the democratization of AI, the rise of no-code coding, so a whole bunch of changes he was able to draw on to inform a slightly different decision in the present.
That's really incredible, and that's actually really practical. You know, if you take a 2-year view or 3-year view, there's almost no impetus to change. You can hang on to anything. You can do anything for a period of 1 year, 2 year. And oftentimes the really hard things are not worth doing unless you at least take a 5-year view. And when we're talking about talent challenges, we're talking about generational challenges about workforce availability. Well, we won't see those things for 5 to 7 years in a real way. We'll start to feel them now. But to take action out ahead of that, it requires a longer view. And not everyone's brave enough to step into that conversation. Sometimes it's easier to be beholden to the tyranny of the urgent, like you said. It's you know, we can do the things that we did before to just survive instead of really differentiate. I have a follow-up question. Is there ever a fear, well, I'm not going to do that because what if I'm wrong? How do you mitigate that fear in that kind of conversation?
One of the things that I find really interesting is that when we take a view that's 10 years, so longer than 5 years, the parts of the brain that are triggered, they're more imaginative. And when we're taking a narrower view, the parts of the brain that are triggered are more historical. So it's kind of based on memory and things that have happened in the past. And for me, that's really important because the future is more likely to be something that we have to imagine because it will be different from today rather than a reflection and repeating of what's happened in the past. So it's almost like a little hack, I guess, to open up more imaginative ways that we can look at what is possible. And the other thing I think to consider there is that the notion that the future is not a straight line. It won't be a projection of more of today. If we look back at the past of work, a lot of that appears to be kind of quite ridiculous now. So the notion that the future will be more of the present is something that we should challenge. So taking the 10-year view actually steps us out of the memory and steps us into imagination, which I actually think is a really critical mechanism for good futuring work, is that we actually need our imagination to think, how could things be different in the present?
I think that's actually a good exercise to help people be braver, even if they're not naturally inclined to be more expansive thinkers. So I will use that as a sort of workshopping hack. We have people that are more or less imaginative, sort of by personality. Are there people that are fearful to step out of the urgent and immediate? And how do you combat that in terms of getting them more comfortable thinking a little bit longer term?
I think the more stress we're under, the more narrow our view becomes. We become very pointed at the present. Everything in front of you seems much more important than contemplating 5 or 10 years down the track. But there's another kind of assumption, I think, that sits under that, is that thinking about the future or futures work is useful for us if we're thinking about long-term things. And the way I tend to describe this work is that all futures work or all contemplation about the future should inform action in the present. So if we're thinking about some of the current dilemmas that we're experiencing, we can use insights about change to actually sometimes transcend those challenges. In some instances, we can use insights about things that are emerging to actually, entirely mitigate. It may not even be a problem in a future if we actually are willing to look outside, lift our gaze a little bit to say, how can we draw on an adjacent possible here? How can we look to the changing environment? And how can that help us challenge our assumptions about this dilemma, step away and ask different questions about how we're framing the problem that we're in? So the big shift, I think, is that we can use the future to help respond to these big dilemmas in the present.
Healthcare is a big end user of our services, hospital systems, and nursing shortages are prevalent in almost every market. And, the tendency is to try to think about stealing a finite resource from another pot versus taking a step back and thinking more expansively. And 10 years is probably the minimum threshold of solving that gap, because we're just, people are retiring. Second earners are just saying, it's not worth it for me to join the workforce. So really doing the old motions can get you some short-term successes, but certainly aren't going to sustain you for the long term. So really stepping back and using that, hey, let's look at this minimum 10 years. We're not talking about anything unless it will have an impact in 10 years. And that takes a lot of those off the table, actually. The things that we might be stuck in swirling and talking about those tactics.
Exactly. And you might find that there are pockets of very different futures in the present that already exist. You just reminded me of a really great example of thinking about the 10-year view and health. If we take, let's say, a 1-year view to a challenge around retention and training for gastroenterologists, just as an example. So particularly in Australia, they take a long time to train. So when you lose them, it's quite a challenging recruitment and attraction dilemma. If we take a narrow view, our responses might be to focus entirely around training. How can we train them faster? What does that look like? How can we get more people through university? If we lift our gaze and take a slightly longer term view, we might ask questions around, well, maybe there are other roles that could do components of this. Do we need gastroenterologists doing scopes? Could we rethink the configuration of who does this? And maybe it's a new role with new responsibilities. If you take a really longer term view, you might start to think about emerging trends around ingestible diagnostics, for instance. And again, it's not about kind of making those changes immediately, but you might start to say, hey, there's some interesting research that's happening here. What are our really small bets in a longer game? You can just see by looking at the one dilemma and taking a very different time view how you can come up with different responses to a really challenging issue.
If we think about this for talent acquisition or talent in general, how do we think about this in the future when actually a lot of your talent, quote unquote, won't even be human?
Well, it's a really interesting point that you raise, and one of the signals of change I've been paying attention to lately is a shift in the language around technology. So it's started to shift to a workforce conversation. We're starting to, talk about the idea of non-human resources inside a workforce conversation. For me, that's a really powerful shift that's occurring. And what does that mean for talent when we're starting to think about human resources and non-human resources. Is that something you're seeing that's emerging in conversations?
It is when we talk about digital workers.
Yeah.
It's euphemisms that we like to put on non-human vehicles that do work. We can fully automate almost everything in the recruitment process at this point. We actually have experimented with that a bit. We had this experiment where they could sign in, they could complete a personality test, they could chat with a very good AI platform that responded in real time. It wasn't just like a beefed up phone tree. It was actually like a decent conversation. And when they went to schedule, they could schedule an appointment to be an interview on site, actually with someone. What we saw was, wow, the throughput for getting someone to schedule an appointment, astronomical. Speed from 8 days down to less than 8 minutes.
Wow.
But what we saw was that people didn't show up because they had not spoken to a human, so there was no one to disappoint. And so we actually inserted what would be like lack of efficiency in the middle of that process because we needed a human to get on the phone and walk through. I mean, we literally said, talk about any part of the recruiting process. Where are you going to get off the highway? What are you going to wear? Whatever. Take 7 minutes and get to know this person, make a human connection. And that actually tripled the show up rates or reduced the no-show rates by a certain percentage, but actually 3 times the amount of people showed up for the job interview because they felt like someone cared. And it's sort of like ghosting in the dating platforms. Everything in talent has to be with, how connected do I feel to the process I'm in? So there is that humanization. We can't get too far away from it because then we're not pushing people around. We're actually making connections with people for what they're going to spend their time, energy, and emotion on. So the future is almost here in a way that we're not ready for. So we have to kind of pull it back to our human core to make it relevant and valuable for us.
I love that example, though, because it's a really brilliant way of showing how do we bring the future into the present. So we're seeing the rise of automation in this process. And for me, I always talk about this idea of small bets in a longer game. So we need to keep the lights on. We need to do the core foundational work. But at the same time, we're seeing automation, AI, changes in talent. And you've just described a really beautiful way of, we're going to bring in a small bet. So we're going to start experimenting with a different way of doing this, and we're going to test and learn. And immediately we started to get a sense of where is the critical human touch points in this process. Automation shouldn't be straight line. So you're experimenting with the future in the present, and this notion of small bets, what's one small way that we can actually start to try this and test this technology is a really brilliant way of how we keep the lights on and design a more viable future in the present.
I think that small bits is a really good way to make it seem not overwhelming, because if we look so far ahead, you could say, wow, the future is daunting. Where do I start? If you know the direction of travel, you can do the next step to get you at least generally headed in that direction. So how do you get to small bits? So how do you take this? So let's assume you've gotten everyone out of their own way. You've unlocked the other parts of the brains. How do you get people then to digest the ideation that they've just come up with and make it real in the present, or pull it back without just sort of staying in 2050 and then not being able to activate anything?
I think that's such a great insight, because part of the challenge is when things feel too far out from the present, we tend to ignore them. And our brain does brilliant filtering. We can't maintain all of the insights about all of the possibilities. So showing evidence of change that's occurring now, I think, is a really powerful way of saying this isn't speculative. There are small bits of concrete evidence where this already exists today. And what does that mean for us? So I think the conversation around change is not just to end with change. It's to say, so what? What are the implications that we're seeing bot-to-bot recruitment? What are the implications of that? Where is there a risk here? Where is there an opportunity? And what might we do come Monday? What's one small thing that we can start to do in response to this potential change come Monday? And sometimes that's just, we're just going to monitor this. We want to keep an eye on this. Or we should start researching more about this topic because it could have a significant impact on us.
So how do we get better at standing in the future? How do we know that we're doing it right? Is that we're right more often? Is it that we have gone down more paths? Is it that we're doing more research? So, how do we do it, and how do we know we're doing it well?
I think there's a few components to this. I think the first one is unlearning. We have to unlearn the way that we've been taught to think about the future. So we've been taught to think that the future is something that's out there and down the track. But of course, the future of work never arrives because we're always in the present. So the future and our future happens via our actions, but also our inactions today. So flipping some of the way that we think about the future and bringing it in to say it's an in here and now conversation. We've got to keep the lights on and we need to look at change and design a more viable future. I think it's really important that this work is not about necessarily trying to get the future precisely right. For me, that takes us away from a sense of agency that we can shape the future because the future hasn't happened. There's no future facts because it hasn't actually happened yet, even though it's described to us as if it's quite set. So we can step away and ask questions to say, well, what's changing? What's changed in the past? What's changing now? And what do we want to change going forward? I always use this rule of 3 strikes. So if it's the third time I hear something about a change, it's the third time I've heard that term, I pay attention. So I'm always scanning for signals of change. And I think the other big thing to consider, and this is a Professor Jim Data quote, saying that the future essentially arrives via the ridiculous. Any useful statement about the future should at first appear ridiculous. Otherwise, it's just a projection of today. And we know that the future won't be more of today. So part of it is in organizations, how do we entertain futures that appear ridiculous at first? And they might seem ridiculous to you, but you go to an adjacent organization or a different sector and it's their everyday practice. Epidemiologists is a perfect example. For years, they would be talking about a pandemic, but in business settings, it wouldn't have been, I imagine, on many people's business plans. But for them, it was not a ridiculous future. It was probably an inevitable future. So part of it is kind of how do we actually entertain this type of thinking inside organizations? And I always talk about habit stack, like how do we have Futures Fridays conversations? How do we bring this into any decision that we make? The question we should be asking is what's changing? What have we assumed here? What's a ridiculous future that we've ignored? And now what does that potentially mean for actions today?
That's really fascinating that you're talking about sort of habit stacking and putting it on the leadership of today and asking them to step outside. I think one of the interesting conundrums that we face and when we talk about especially longer term thinking with businesses is if you think about the average tenure of an entry-level employee is less than 1 year, an average tenure of a tenured employee is probably 3 to 5 years now, an average tenure of a senior employee is less than 10 years. How do you get them to think long-term when they're not going to be the face of long-term in a company? How do you tie that to someone's personal interest of why would I talk about that when it doesn't happen to me?
That's so interesting in terms of the turnover. I think it always comes back to how does this help us navigate the present? And when you're solving and responding to a dilemma for someone, if you've got some insights on how they might do that, I think there's like a high drive to want to listen to that. So for me, it's always connecting this work, not to an imagined state or a world that might eventuate that you might not exist in, but how does it actually inform the decisions that we're making today?
I want to go back to one of the words you said, which is agency, and how, in terms of really taking control of the conversation versus sort of this learned feeling or this learned emotion about the future is something that's going to happen to us versus doing, or like you said, doing or not doing actually shapes the path that we're on. So when we think about humans love that feeling of security and control. Agency is kind of a proxy for that. How do you bring that feeling of agency and control into the conversation versus just, let's speculate what's going to happen and how we react to it? How do you change the language in that conversation to be more proactive?
I think it comes back to the way that we think about the future. There's some common ways that we think about the future. We tend to think about it as a time that's later than now, a single end state kind of world that we arrive in or a place that we go. We tend to have a very objective-based, it's about systems and structures and technologies. And there's a hint in that I think if we can reframe that, it allows to unlock a whole bunch of agency. As I mentioned earlier, is that notion that the future doesn't exist and that there are no future facts because the future hasn't happened. So the future can't be predicted, it can only be imagined. And I think the sense that the future hasn't actually happened yet and that we do have capacity to shape the future via the actions and inactions that we make in the present. So it's less about kind of responding to things that are imposed And it's more about stepping back. I always think that futures conversations is really about how do we step away and ask more elegant questions of the present. How do we step back and say, what's changing? What's changed? How do we want this to change in the future? What do we want the future of work to be like for workers? What do we want talent to be like in 5 to 10 years' time? I think that spaciousness can be really helpful in building agency, and the fact that it hasn't happened. So there are no facts. When you're thinking about the future of talent, and my view is I think that talent is the canary in the coal mine. They're in between, organizations and workers. They really are, I think, the brilliant futurists. They're collecting signals of change about how things are shifting in real time. What are some of the things that you're paying attention to around what's changing, and what are some of the signals that you're seeing?
Well, thank you. I think any recruiter on the front line would always say that they are the first to hear about things, whether it's a change or a trend. And I think, we were the first people to hear that people didn't want full-time jobs,
yes,
that they were looking for more flexible employment, that people were asking about what's the purpose of your company? What's the reason that you exist? So those early signs of people wanting more from their job or less, actually, more flexibility. We are the people that reported back when remote working was an option, probably the first to say we're getting triple the applicant flow if you just put remote on workforce. So what does that mean for the workforce? People don't want to come in all the time, but then we kind of quickly contradict ourselves with, but they're also asking if there's an office they can go into. So nobody wanted to say you had to go in, but they, it's those nuances that it's really tough to capture that in a study or a survey. And to your point about asking more elegant questions, sometimes those okay, I've heard it 3 times. You like the remote work, but you're asking, is there a location where I can gather to meet the people I work with? Those are some of the trends that we are watching to say, really, what's the human driver behind some of the questions? So we've been talking a lot about the world of work from the employer viewpoint. I actually want to be selfish for a minute. I have 4 children, and some of them are quite young. And when they ask me, how should I think about the future and the world of work, even what should I be thinking about for my own life, I don't even know where to begin because so much seems to be disrupting every year. And even my 20-year-old has a different reality than my 8-year-old does. So how, as humans, do we also take some of your life hacks? What should we be thinking about to be better futurists?
I think taking ideas and concepts and methods and processes from futures thinking and applying that at the personal end is a really critical thing for workers navigating the future work or soon-to-be workers. For me, I think we're now in a world where it's no longer predict and control. And so the way that we think about our careers, if you think we used to sit down and we'd say, what are we really good at? What do we enjoy doing? And in some ways that's useful, but the whole world of work has fundamentally changed. So we really have to shift towards an approach of our own careers to sense and respond. We're constantly looking to say, well, how are things changing? What does that mean for me? What are the small bets that I can start to think about as a worker? I'm in this particular role, but I'm starting to anticipate there's some shifts around automation, AI, technology. I'm seeing the emergence of other sectors. What are the small bets that I can do come Monday that might help slightly shift the trajectory? So again, I'm really big on it's not about turning the Titanic unless you have to. It's kind of saying, how do we keep the lights on? I need to work. I need to be in the role that I'm in. But what are the small things I can do come Monday? Can I start researching pathways of other people that have transitioned into very different industries or jobs? Can I start to think about small, short courses to learn more about a particular topic? Can I start to test some ideas about a sector or a job that I think I'd like to do? I think about the analogy of a plane. So if the plane is shifting in its trajectory by 2 or 3 degrees, in the short term, it doesn't make a lot of difference, but over the long term, it makes a significant difference. You arrive somewhere different at the end of that. So that's one way of really thinking about small actions in the present, even as workers or as organizations that are slightly different. I talk about the adjacent possible. What are the things that are possible to what we're doing right now? And investment in those small things can make a significant difference over the long term.
I think that's a really great analogy. If you have a short time horizon, well, almost no adjustment seems to be worthwhile. So I love that. The small things, and think about it more like a trajectory than a destination or an event, a time horizon. That's really great. So, Reanna, thank you for your great insights. I think it's a ton to consider, but if I had to ask you for one parting thought on how we remain present, but also keep an eye to the future, what would be your parting thought to the listeners?
There's a couple of parting thoughts. So firstly, I think lifting our gaze. I love the notion that we're taking a 2050 view here to think about the action in the present. If we go back to that idea that any useful statement about the future should at first appear ridiculous, we really do need to lift our gaze far beyond the present. And that's a really powerful technique and process that helps us look at the present through very different lenses. We see totally new ways of thinking about things. So again, it's less about kind of what might happen in the year 2050 and more about how does that framing and thinking shift our view of the present and what we might need to do. I think it's back to the notion of the 3 strikes rule. So pay attention to change. The third time you hear something, start to pay attention and ask the question of, well, so what, now what? What does that mean for us as a business, for me as a worker? And what might I do come Monday? I think the idea of small bets, as I mentioned, I'm really big on that because if the future feels big, it feels heavy, it feels like a lot of work. So what are the very small things that we can do come Monday? And for me, that's a real powerful way to build agency and pathways. And the last thing is a habit stack. You know, we have conversations with our teams and we get together regularly. Where can we fold in a quick conversation about the future? What are the things that you're paying attention to? You know, what have we assumed here? If we were thinking about a ridiculous future for this topic, what would that look like? And is there any evidence of that in the present? You don't need to be a futurist. We all have innate foresight capacity. So I think it's leaning on that and really integrating it into the everyday flow of our work.
Thank you. That was incredible, actually. That was like the best wrap up. You did the wrap up for me. So that was amazing. I just wanted to say thank you for making time. And this was like a really fascinating conversation. I just think the way that you broke down the concepts to manageable pieces of information, it was great. I learned a lot. So thank you.
That's brilliant. I'm so happy to be involved. I'm really encouraged by the work and the way that you're trying to, rethink how we think, which I think is the real acupuncture point. Rather than necessarily changing how we act, it's like, well, what if we actually just shifted how we thought about the future in the first place? And the simple use of taking a 2050 view is a really powerful way of doing that.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm going to steal some of these techniques.
Brilliant. I love that.
I know I'll be following Reanna's advice in more of my discussions with other guests about the world of 2050. I'll be unlearning what I think I know about the future and embracing that more exploratory, less predictive actually brings more valuable foresight. If this episode sparked your interest, then let's chat about it. Share your thoughts with us on social media channels or through our website. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay up to date with the latest episodes. And join me next time as we continue to explore the exciting possibilities of the future with the Talent Time Machine. Thanks for listening.